Victorian middle-class brides typically married between 18 and 22. The vast majority arrived at their wedding nights with virtually no information about what was supposed to happen. Mothers whispered vague warnings about duty. Dictionaries omitted words like ovary and menstruation entirely. The era's prevailing theory was that ignorance preserved virtue. A pure girl was a sexless angel, and any knowledge of the marital act was considered a contamination. But this carefully constructed innocence had a devastating consequence. Preserved virtue shattered on contact with reality, and what should have been a beginning became, for countless young women, a night of absolute terror. This was England in the middle of the 19th century, a world of strict manners, heavy curtains, and an unshakable belief that a woman's purity was her most valuable possession. The ideal bride was not merely innocent, she was a blank slate, a sexless angel who floated above the crude realities of the flesh. Girls were raised in a deliberate fog of silence. Mothers believed that to speak of marriage's physical side was to corrupt. Medical books were locked away. Even dictionaries conspired in the conspiracy, quietly omitting anything that hinted at the body's private functions. The result was a generation of young women, often married by 18 to men twice their age, who stepped into the marriage chamber knowing less about what awaited them than a child. They had been taught to trust their husbands absolutely, to submit, to obey. But no one had told them what to submit to. The gap between the wedding ceremony and the bedroom was a chasm, and the men they married, while expected to initiate their innocent brides, had often gained their own knowledge from brothels or worldly friends. So you had two entirely different worlds colliding in the dark, one of sheltered virtue, the other of unspoken experience. The question that haunted countless honeymoons was simple. What happened when the veil came off and the gas lamp was turned down? What exactly were these brides told beforehand, and what were they deliberately kept from knowing? The answers would unfold in whispered confessions, secret diaries, and a generation of women who would spend the rest of their lives recovering from that first night. To understand the wedding night, you must first understand the wedding day. For a middle-class Victorian girl, it was the single most important day of her life. Not because of love, though that was lovely if it happened, but because marriage was her entire future, her only career, her sole escape from the dependency of daughterhood into the dependency of wifehood. She had been trained for this day since birth. Needlepoint, piano, French, the art of arranging flowers and never expressing an opinion too loudly. Everything pointed toward becoming a wife. And yet, the one piece of information that would define her very first night as a married woman, the one detail that separated childhood from adulthood, was treated as utterly unspeakable. The philosophy was simple and brutal. A pure woman was a woman without knowledge. Physical knowledge, that is. She was expected to be a sexless angel, a creature of moral elevation who floated above the animal instincts that plagued men. Doctors, clergymen, and writers all agreed. Female desire was either non-existent or a dangerous aberration. Respectable girls were raised in a state of cultivated ignorance so profound that many did not know how babies were made until they were well into their own pregnancies. Some never truly understood it at all. The body was a source of shame. Even looking at one's own unclothed form was discouraged. Bathing was often done in a chemise to avoid the sin of self-awareness. Into this sealed world, no word could enter. The gatekeepers of this ignorance were often the very people who loved the girl most, her own mother. Victorian mothers were themselves products of the same system, and they passed it on with the best of intentions. The night before the wedding, or sometimes the morning of, there would come a moment. The mother would draw the bride aside, take her hands, and deliver what was known as the talk. But this talk was a masterpiece of evasion. It rarely contained any actual information. A typical version might be, "Tonight you must submit to your husband's will. It will be unpleasant, but it is your duty. Bear it quietly, and God will reward your sacrifice." That was it. No anatomy, No explanation of what exactly she was submitting to. Just a whispered command to endure. Some mothers gave their daughters a handkerchief and told them to bite down. Others simply said to think of England, and it would be over soon. The bride was left with a vague sense of dread and a head full of terrifying gaps. But here is the thing. While the bride was being fed silence, the groom was receiving an entirely different education. Victorian men of the middle and upper classes were expected to sow their wild oats before marriage. Discreetly, of course. Prostitution was rampant, and it was tacitly accepted that a young man would gain his experience with women of the lower classes so that he might be a competent, if not considerate, husband. He might have been given a manual by a friend in the weeks before his wedding, a little book with anatomical diagrams and instructions on how to initiate a virgin. These manuals were passed around in secret, kept locked in desk drawers, and never shared with the innocent creature he was about to wed. So on the wedding night, two worlds collided. The groom, who might have years of experience, and the bride, who had been told to bite a handkerchief and pray. The gulf between them was not merely physical. It was a chasm of understanding, and the bride was always the one who fell into it. The machinery of ignorance extended far beyond the home. It was built into the very language of the time. Dictionaries, those supposedly neutral records of all human knowledge, were carefully sanitized. Words like semen, ovary, and menstruation simply did not appear. If a curious girl tried to look up a term she had overheard, she would find nothing. The knowledge was locked away as if it did not exist. Medical textbooks were kept under lock and key in many households, accessible only to the father or perhaps to older brothers, but never to daughters. Even the Bible, with its frank passages, was often read aloud only in select portions. The result was a generation of women who knew a great deal about embroidery and very little about their own bodies. When their monthly cycles began, many were terrified, thinking they were dying or being punished by God. No one had warned them. Why would they, when the entire culture had agreed that innocence was a woman's greatest treasure? And what a treasure it was! A bride's virginity was not just a moral condition. It was a commodity. It determined her value on the marriage market. A girl who knew too much, who displayed curiosity about the physical world, was damaged goods. Her reputation could be ruined by a single rumor, a glance held too long, a book found under her pillow. The stakes were impossibly high, so the girl learned to perform innocence even if she had secretly glimpsed a piece of knowledge. She learned to blush, to look away, to claim ignorance of the most basic facts of life. She became an actress in her own life, playing the part of the pure angel because her entire future depended on it. And the most critical performance of all would take place on her wedding night, in a hotel room or a new home, with a man she might have met only a handful of times, a man who was now legally entitled to her body, and who had been told by his friends that his new wife would be reluctant, but would eventually thank him for his patience. The wedding itself was a blur. The white dress, popularized by Queen Victoria, symbolized purity and new beginnings. The church was filled with flowers and well-wishers. Vows were exchanged. Promises to love, honor, and obey were made. And then came the wedding breakfast, the toasts, the rice thrown at the carriage. All of it a public celebration of a private union that was about to become terrifyingly real. As the afternoon wore on and the couple departed for their honeymoon, the bride's heart would begin to race. The jokes from the groomsmen, the knowing winks from the older women, all hinted at something she could not name. Her new husband, suddenly a stranger in his confidence, would help her into the carriage and speak of the journey ahead. But all she could think of was the night that awaited her at the end of the road. Hotels were the preferred destination for middle-class honeymoons, a neutral ground away from family, a place of locked doors and thick curtains. The couple would arrive in the evening, take a suite, perhaps dine downstairs, and all the while, the bride's mind churned. She had no map for what was coming. Some brides tried to ask their husbands what to expect. Most were met with a patronizing smile and a reassurance that it would all be fine. Others were told simply to trust him. A few lucky ones found their grooms to be gentle and patient, willing to wait days or even weeks before insisting on consummation. But many were not so fortunate. The wedding night was a duty, and duties were to be performed. The law of the land gave a husband absolute rights over his wife's body. Consent was not a concept that applied to marriage. What happened behind the bedroom door was private, and privacy meant no one would intervene. The scene was set. The gas lamp was turned down low. The heavy curtains blocked out the moon. The new wife, still in her wedding dress, sat on the edge of the enormous bed, her veil removed, her hands trembling. Her husband moved toward her. She knew nothing. Not the mechanics, not the purpose, not the possibility of pleasure. She knew only that she must submit, that this was her duty, and that any sign of resistance would be a failure of her character. She had been told that ignorance preserved virtue, but as the door clicked shut and the room shrank around her, that preserved virtue felt less like a treasure and more like a trap. What happened next would depend entirely on the man she had married. But whatever it was, she would face it utterly alone, with no words to name it and no one to tell. This was the wedding night for countless Victorian brides, and the stories they would carry from it, of terror, confusion, and sometimes flight, would be whispered for generations. One woman, married in 1859 at the age of 18, later wrote in her diary a single line that has echoed through history. "How I cried at Paris." The nights. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Every Victorian who read those words understood exactly what she meant. The wedding trip was supposed to be a celebration, a journey into a new life. For Mary Sidgwick, it was a catastrophe. She had arrived at her honeymoon suite with no more understanding of what was to come than a child of 4. Her mother, meaning well, had shielded her from all knowledge of sorrow and sin, and now sorrow and sin were standing in the room with her, wearing her husband's face, and she had no words for it. She cried in Paris, and she was not alone. The stories that survivors later told, in diaries, in letters, in whispered confessions decades later, followed a hauntingly similar pattern. The new bride, nervous but trusting, would be left alone with her husband in a strange hotel room. The gas lamp would be turned down low. The heavy furniture loomed in the shadows. And then something would happen that she could not have imagined because she had been given no raw material with which to imagine it. Some women froze, some wept, some fought, and a surprising number of them fled to the most private refuge available, the hotel bathroom. The Victorian bathroom, even in a good hotel, was a cold, tiled sanctuary with a lock on the door, and brides used it, not for bathing, for survival. The story of the bride who locked herself in the bathroom on her wedding night became so common that it was almost a cliché, except it was true and it was tragic. A young woman, still in her white dress, huddled against the porcelain bathtub, her veil crumpled on the floor, refusing to come out. Her husband knocking, first gently, then with irritation, then with threats. And she, with her back against the door, unable to explain what had so terrified her, because she lacked the vocabulary to describe it. The body she had been taught to ignore had suddenly become the center of an experience she had been told was her duty, but which felt like an assault. The conflict between duty and revulsion tore her apart. Duty said submit. Every instinct said flee. So she sat on the cold tiles and waited for the sun to rise, hoping that daylight would make the nightmare dissolve. But here is what the sanitized versions of history often omit. The groom was not always a monster. Many of these men were themselves bewildered. They had been told by their friends, by the manuals they had secretly read, that their new wives would be shy but compliant, that a little firmness and patience would overcome any reluctance. They had not been prepared for the reality of a woman so utterly ignorant that she experienced the marital act as a violation. Some grooms backed away, confused, and slept on the sofa. Others persisted, believing they were doing what was expected. A wife who resisted was a wife who had not been properly trained to her duty. The manuals they carried in their luggage, the ones passed from older brother to younger, from friend to friend, gave precise instructions on how to initiate a virgin. These books had titles like The Married Man's Guide or The Husband's Handbook. They advised a mixture of tenderness and authority. But they assumed a baseline of knowledge that did not exist. They assumed the bride would understand what was being asked of her. And they assumed that female reluctance was a charming formality rather than genuine terror. The men were not equipped to bridge the chasm. They had been raised in the same culture, a culture that told them women were angels and sex was a beastly necessity. Their own desires were something they had learned to satisfy in secret, with women they would never marry. Now, suddenly, they were expected to perform the same acts with the pure angel they had just vowed to protect. The psychological whiplash was devastating for both parties. But only one party had the lock on the bathroom door. The locked bathroom phenomenon was so widespread that it found its way into the fiction of the period, often played for nervous laughter. But behind the closed doors, real women were having real breakdowns. Some brides, unable to articulate their terror, simply became hysterical. Victorian medicine had a diagnosis for this: female hysteria, a catch-all term for any emotional disturbance in a woman that men could not explain. The treatment, often, was a dose of laudanum or a sedative. The underlying cause was never addressed because addressing it would require acknowledging that the ignorance they had so carefully cultivated was backfiring in the most catastrophic way. A bride who arrived at her wedding night with no knowledge was a bride who arrived with no consent, not because she said no, but because she could not possibly say yes. She did not know what she was consenting to. And the law, the church, and the culture all agreed that her ignorance was the very thing that made her worthy of marriage. The paradox was razor-sharp, and it cut deeply. The mother's whispered conversation the night before the wedding was supposed to prepare her. But as we have seen, it prepared her for nothing. The classic formula, "Lie still and think of England," was not a joke invented by modern comedians. It was real advice handed from one generation to the next. A bride was to close her eyes, detach her mind, and endure. She was to be a passive vessel for her husband's needs. The idea that she might have needs of her own was not merely ignored. It was actively denied. Medical texts of the time, written by men, declared that women of the respectable classes had little to no sexual desire. One prominent physician, William Acton, wrote in 1857 that the majority of women are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. He went further. He claimed that a virtuous woman would submit to her husband's embraces only out of a sense of duty, and that any woman who experienced pleasure was morally suspect. This was not a fringe opinion. It was mainstream medical doctrine, and it was quoted in marriage manuals, in sermons, in the advice columns of ladies' magazines. The message was clear. A pure wife felt nothing. If she felt something, she was impure. The catch, of course, was that female sexuality is a biological reality, not a moral failing. But the Victorian medical establishment had built an entire edifice of lies on the assumption that it was a moral failing, and they pathologized any evidence to the contrary. The pamphlets and booklets that circulated among the educated classes took this doctrine and ran with it. A particularly infamous pamphlet, The Young Wife's Guide, written by a physician who hid behind a pseudonym, warned that marital pleasure could cause nervous prostration. The term nervous prostration was a Victorian catch-all for what we might now call a nervous breakdown or chronic fatigue syndrome. But in this context, it was a threat. If a woman allowed herself to experience pleasure during the marital act, her entire nervous system would collapse. She would become an invalid, unfit for motherhood, for household management, for polite society. The pamphlet detailed symptoms: trembling, palpitations, hysteria, a wandering womb that could cause all manner of internal chaos. The remedy was simple: abstain from pleasure. Endure the act, but never engage with it. Lie still. Think of England, and pray that your constitution survives. The fact that these pamphlets were written by men who had no access to female interior experience did not diminish their authority. Women read them, or had them read aloud by their mothers, and believed. Meanwhile, the manuals intended for grooms offered a starkly different picture. They acknowledged that sexual desire existed, at least in men, and that a husband had a right to expect his wife to fulfill her conjugal obligations. But many of these manuals also contained a startling omission. They assumed that the wife would learn to enjoy the act over time, with patience and gentle instruction. They almost never addressed the possibility that the wife had been so thoroughly conditioned to fear and repress her own body that no amount of patience could undo the damage. They were maps for a terrain that did not exist. The groom, armed with his secret handbook, would approach his bride with a plan. He would be slow. He would be gentle. He would explain things in simple terms. And the bride, whose entire inner landscape had been paved over with shame and silence, would look at him as if he was speaking a foreign language. Because he was. He was speaking the language of the body, and she had been taught that the body was a source of sin. The disconnect was total. And when gentleness failed, frustration followed. When frustration failed, force sometimes took its place. And when force was used, the bride's terror was confirmed. The very thing she had been taught to fear had arrived, wearing the face of the man who had promised to love and cherish her. Some brides did not lock themselves in the bathroom. Some ran further. They fled the hotel entirely, or they waited until morning and then demanded to be taken home. The story of Lady Caroline, a grandmother who married at 16 to a much older man, became family legend in certain aristocratic circles. After the unspeakableness of the wedding night, she ran back to her parents and begged for an annulment. The annulment was not granted. She was sent back to her husband. The law was on his side. A wife was not permitted to refuse her husband's bed. Marital rape was not a crime. It was not even a concept. The legal doctrine of coverture meant that a woman's legal existence was suspended upon marriage. She was absorbed into her husband. Her body was his property. She had no right to refuse, no right to flee, no right to complain. The locked bathroom door was an act of rebellion, but it was a rebellion with no legal backing. If her husband chose to break the door down, there was no constable who would intervene. There was no helpline, no shelter, no sympathetic magistrate. There was only the long walk back to the bedroom and the cold command to do her duty. And yet, amidst the darkness, there were flickers of light. Not all mothers were content to whisper the duty talk and leave their daughters to their fate. A small minority of progressive mothers, often influenced by the early stirrings of the women's rights movement or by their own bitter experience, attempted to give their daughters real information. They did so at great risk. If the community learned that a mother was instructing her daughter in such matters, the family's reputation could be destroyed. So these conversations happened in secret, in the garden, in the still of the night, with the bedroom door locked. The mother would speak in hushed tones, using euphemisms that still fell short of full transparency, but at least gestured toward reality. She might say, "Your husband will want to share your bed in a way that will seem strange to you. It is not something to be feared if he is gentle. It is how children are made. You may even find it pleasurable in time, though it is not polite to admit such things." This was revolutionary. To suggest that pleasure was possible, even if one must never speak of it, was to crack open a door that the culture had nailed shut. The daughters who received this version of the talk carried a small, flickering candle into their wedding nights. They were still terrified. They still did not fully understand, but they had been given permission, however tentative, to view their bodies as something other than a trap. And that permission made all the difference. The real pivot, however, did not come from a handful of brave mothers. It came from a growing chorus of voices that refused to accept the silence. In the 1870s and 80s, a new generation of women, some of them survivors of traumatic wedding nights themselves, began to write. Not fiction, but advocacy. They wrote pamphlets, letters, and eventually books that dared to name the unnameable. They argued that ignorance was not a virtue, but a vulnerability. They pointed out that a woman who did not understand her own body could not make informed decisions about her health, her fertility, or her marriage. They were often vilified. They were called immoral, unwomanly, a threat to the social order. But they kept writing, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the wall of silence began to crack. The first cracks were small, a paragraph in a women's magazine that hinted at the need for preparation, a lecture at a progressive society that touched on the subject of marital hygiene, a book sold discreetly that offered basic anatomical information under the guise of medical advice for mothers. Each crack was met with outrage and suppression. But the tide was turning. The question that had been forced into the locked bathroom was now being asked in public. What are we doing to our daughters? And at what cost? Meanwhile, the medical establishment was beginning to split. A few brave doctors, having witnessed the wreckage firsthand, began to question the doctrine of female sexlessness. They saw the nervous prostration, the hysteria, the broken marriages, and they began to connect the dots. Was it possible, they asked, that the suppression of natural instincts was itself the cause of these ailments? A radical idea. If women were not, in fact, naturally passionless, then the entire edifice of Victorian sexual morality was built on a lie. And if it was built on a lie, then millions of women were suffering for nothing. This was a dangerous thought. It threatened the very foundations of marriage, of gender roles, of social order. But it was also a true thought. And once a true thought is planted, it grows, even in the most hostile soil. The doctors who voiced it risked their careers. Some were forced to retract. Others were ostracized. But the idea could not be unthought. The suffering of women, the tears in Paris, the locked hotel doors, the annulment pleas that were denied, all of it pointed toward a single, devastating conclusion. The system was not protecting purity. It was manufacturing trauma. And the trauma was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the predictable, inevitable result of a system designed to keep women powerless. The greatest trick the Victorian era ever pulled was convincing women that their ignorance was their virtue. But the truth was clawing its way into the light, and it was about to explode. And when it exploded, it took the form of a quiet revolution, fought not in the streets but in the pages of books and pamphlets that slipped through the cracks of a censored world. The explosion was not a single event, but a series of detonations, each one building on the last, each one tearing a wider hole in the wall of silence that had imprisoned millions of women. And behind that wall, the wreckage was staggering, because for every bride who locked herself in a bathroom or fled to her parents, there were thousands more who simply endured. They did their duty. They lay still. They thought of England. And then they got up the next morning, dressed in the clothes of a respectable wife, and never spoke of it again. The silence that had preceded the wedding night was now compounded by the silence that followed it, and that second silence was perhaps even more damaging. The medical profession, in its collective wisdom, had a name for what happened to women whose wedding night trauma festered in the dark. They called it neurasthenia, a catch-all diagnosis that covered everything from migraines to suicidal despair. The treatment was rest. Not therapy, not an honest conversation, but rest. Weeks or months in a darkened room, away from all stimulation, often fed a liquid diet, with no books, no visitors, no purpose other than to recover from a nervous system that had been, in the words of doctors, overtaxed by the demands of married life. No one asked what demands. No one connected the nervous collapse to the sexual terror that had preceded it. The body's rebellion was treated as a personal failing. A woman who could not perform her marital duties without falling apart was simply not strong enough. She needed to be built up with tonics and cold baths and brisk walks until she could once again submit without complaint. The cycle was vicious and self-perpetuating. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. The doctors who rejected the notion of female sexual pleasure did not merely ignore it, they actively punished it. A woman who showed signs of desire, who seemed to enjoy the act, or who sought out knowledge or control over her own body, risked being labeled a nymphomaniac or, even worse, a hysteric. And the treatments for hysteria were barbaric. Pelvic massage, performed by a doctor, which often resulted in what we would now recognize as orgasm, but which the Victorians described as a paroxysm that relieved the nervous tension. The procedure was clinical, mechanical, and stripped of any acknowledgement of female sexuality. It was a release of pressure, not a human experience. Some doctors even used early vibrators, steam-powered or hand-cranked devices to induce these paroxysms more efficiently. The irony was staggering. A woman was expected to endure her husband's advances without feeling, but a doctor could manipulate her body to achieve precisely the response that the culture denied existed. And no one saw the contradiction, because in the doctor's office it was medicine. In the marriage bed it was sin. For women whose trauma manifested not as hysteria but as physical pain, the treatments were even more invasive. The condition known as vaginismus, a muscular contraction that made intercourse impossible, was not understood as a psychological response to fear and ignorance. It was seen as a defect, a mechanical malfunction, and the proposed cures ranged from the brutal to the surgical. Some doctors recommended gradual dilation with metal instruments, a procedure so painful that women dreaded the treatment more than the marital act itself. Others went further, performing clitoridectomies, the surgical removal of the clitoris, which was believed to be the source of female sexual excitement, and therefore, in the logic of the time, the root of many nervous disorders. The operation was championed by a prominent London surgeon named Isaac Baker Brown in the 1860s. He claimed it cured hysteria, epilepsy, and even the tendency to disobey one's husband. He performed it on women without their full consent, often telling them it was a minor procedure to remove an inflammation. The medical establishment eventually condemned him, not because they defended women's rights, but because his work brought the profession into disrepute. The practice faded, but the underlying belief that female sexuality was a disease to be cut out did not, and the Church, which still held immense sway over public morality, reinforced every one of these horrors. The Victorian pulpit preached that woman was created from Adam's rib to be his helpmeet, not his equal. Her body was a vessel for his seed and for the bearing of children. Any deviation from this purpose was a corruption of God's design. The clergy who whispered prayers with fearful brides before the wedding ceremony did not prepare them for what lay ahead. They prepared them for submission. They told them that suffering was a woman's lot, that Eve's curse was pain in childbirth and subjugation to her husband's will. The wedding night, with all its terror and confusion, was just the first installment of that curse. And a good Christian wife bore it with meekness. The result was a society that had perfected a system of institutionalized trauma. The legal system backed it up. The Coverture Act, which erased a woman's legal identity upon marriage, meant that she could not own property, could not sign contracts, could not even keep her own wages without her husband's permission. Her body was his. Her children were his. Her very existence was subsumed into his. If she fled the marital bed, he could sue for restitution of conjugal rights, and the court would order her to return. The judges, all men, lectured recalcitrant wives on their duties. They called them selfish, unnatural, a disgrace to their sex. And if the husband used force to assert his rights, the law offered no recourse. A husband could not rape his wife. It was a legal impossibility, as if the marriage contract had signed away her capacity to be violated. This doctrine remained in force well into the 20th century. The private hell of the wedding night was just the beginning of a lifetime in which a woman's body belonged to someone else. Yet, despite the crushing weight of all this, women found ways to speak. In the margins of diaries, in letters smuggled to trusted friends, in the coded language that women have always used to survive oppression, a counter-narrative began to emerge. The story of one woman, a social activist named Annie Besant, captures the turning point. In 1866, at the age of 20, she married a clergyman. She later wrote that her ignorance of all that marriage meant was as profound as though she had been a child of 4. Her mother had meant only the happiest for her when she shielded her from all knowledge. But the shield became a cage. The wedding night was a catastrophe, and the marriage that followed was an agony of misunderstanding and pain. Annie Besant did not stay silent. She became one of the most prominent reformers of her age, advocating for women's education, for birth control, for the right to understand one's own body. She and others like her were the first wave of a flood that would not be held back. The 1870s and 80s saw the emergence of the social purity movement, a fraught and complex force. On one hand, it sought to combat the double standard that allowed men to visit prostitutes while demanding purity from their wives. On the other hand, it was often deeply conservative, promoting abstinence and moral reform rather than sexual knowledge. But within its ranks, a more radical strain took root. Women who had survived the wedding night themselves began to argue that purity was not about ignorance. It was about informed choice. A woman who knew her own body could choose virtue with her eyes open, rather than having it imposed upon her like a blindfold. These arguments were dangerous. They led directly to the Contagious Diseases Act's debates, in which the state's regulation of prostitutes was challenged, and to the growing call for girls' education that included basic physiology. The word began to slip past the censors, slowly, in scientific lectures, in pamphlets sold at railway stations, in the back pages of magazines that called themselves family reading. Women began to find fragments of the truth. But the backlash was ferocious. Every advance was met with a counterattack. When a woman named Elizabeth Wolstenholme Elmy dared to write about the physical aspects of marriage in the 1890s, she was vilified as a corrupter of youth. Publishers refused to handle her work. Bookstores were raided. The Obscene Publications Act was used to seize pamphlets that described female anatomy in accurate terms. The same laws that were meant to suppress pornography were deployed against health education. A diagram of the uterus was legally equivalent to a dirty postcard. The absurdity was breathtaking, but the consequences were real. Women died of preventable conditions because they could not describe their symptoms without shame. Women spent decades in silent agony because they did not know that their pain had a name. And the wedding night continued to be a horror for countless brides, because the information that could have saved them was locked away by men who believed that knowledge was more dangerous than suffering. Then, in the final years of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th, a series of events began to converge. The suffragette movement was gathering force, demanding not just the vote, but a complete reordering of women's place in society. Young women were entering higher education in larger numbers, studying biology and medicine, and they were not content to be told that their bodies were mysteries too sacred to investigate. A few pioneering female doctors, such as Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, broke into the medical profession and began to treat women with dignity and honesty. They saw the damage firsthand: the prolapsed organs from too frequent pregnancies, the infections from untreated childbirth injuries, the psychological wreckage of sexual trauma. They could not fix it with rest cures and laudanum. They needed to talk, and talk they did, quietly, in consulting rooms and in letters, building a network of knowledge that spread from woman to woman, doctor to patient, mother to daughter. The wall was now riddled with holes. And then came the book that would blow the wall apart entirely. A book written not by a doctor, but by a paleobotanist who had lived through her own devastating marriage and understood, from the inside, what ignorance had cost. Her name was Marie Stopes. She had been a brilliant scientist, the first woman to teach at the University of Manchester, a scholar of fossil plants. But her first marriage, contracted in 1911, had been annulled after 5 years on the grounds of non-consummation. The truth, which she later admitted, was that both she and her husband had been so appallingly ignorant of sexual mechanics that they had never managed to have intercourse. She had been a virgin bride, educated, brilliant, but utterly clueless about her own body. And when she finally, painfully, acquired the knowledge through a subsequent relationship, she realized that her experience was not exceptional. It was the norm. Millions of women were suffering in silence because no one had ever told them the simplest facts. And so, in 1918, Marie Stopes picked up her pen and wrote a book called Married Love. She did not know, as she wrote, that she was about to change the world. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The silence had to end, and she was the one who would end it. Married Love was published on March 26, 1918. The timing was almost supernatural. The Great War was in its final months. Young men had died by the millions. Women had been pulled out of parlors and into factories, into nursing, into a world where the old rules no longer held. The rigid Victorian certainties were crumbling. And into that shaken landscape, a book appeared that spoke directly to the hunger no one admitted having. The book was small, bound in plain cloth, with no illustrations and no sensational cover. It could pass for a volume of poetry or a domestic manual. And in a sense, it was both. The opening sentence was disarmingly simple. Every heart desires a mate. But what followed was a literary earthquake. Marie Stopes described, in clear but decorous language, the physical relationship of marriage. She explained the anatomy. She described the act itself not as a duty to be endured, but as a dance to be learned, a rhythm to be shared. She wrote about female desire as a natural, beautiful force, not a deformity. She insisted that no sexual act should take place unless the woman also desired it. This was not a whisper. This was a declaration. And the women of Britain, starved for generations of honest information, seized it with both hands. The numbers told the story. 2,000 copies sold in the first fortnight. That was fast, but it was only the beginning. By the end of the year, 6 more editions had been printed. Within 12 months, over 500,000 copies had been purchased in Britain alone. Not borrowed, not passed secretly from hand to hand, but purchased by people who had never before bought a book about sex, by wives who hid it in their sewing baskets, by mothers who read it and then, for the first time, sat down with their daughters and had the real conversation, by young men who wanted to be better husbands. The demand was so overwhelming that booksellers could not keep it on the shelves, and yet it was never advertised in a traditional sense. The promotion was all word of mouth. One woman told another. A sister passed it to a sister. A midwife recommended it to a new bride. The silence that had held for a century was breaking, not with a roar, but with a rustle of turning pages. And the pages contained revelations that seem almost quaint today, but were, in 1918, revolutionary. Stopes wrote that a woman's sexual desire often took longer to awaken than a man's, and that a considerate husband would wait, would coax, would never demand. She explained that the wedding night should not be a single traumatic event, but a slow unfolding over days or even weeks. She used metaphors from her own field of botany, comparing the sexual embrace to the entwining of flowers and the ripening of fruit. It was romantic, scientific, and profoundly subversive, because it told women that their pleasure mattered, not simply as a byproduct of their husband's satisfaction, but as a goal in itself. It told men that their wives were not passive vessels but partners, and that a happy marriage depended on mutual fulfillment. It was, in essence, the manual that the brides of the 1850s and 60s should have had, the conversation their mothers should have been able to give them. It arrived 60 years too late for them, but just in time for their granddaughters. The letters poured into Stopes's home in a flood. Thousands of letters. Women wrote to thank her for saving their marriages, for naming their pain, for giving them permission to feel. Many of the letters were heartbreaking. Women described wedding nights that had scarred them for decades. They described husbands who had been brutal, who had used the marriage bed as a weapon. They described the years of silent suffering, the nervous breakdowns, the rest cures that did nothing. And they said that married love was the first thing that had ever made them understand what had gone wrong. Some wrote that they had wept as they read, not from sorrow, but from relief. The relief of knowing that they were not alone, that their bodies were not broken, that the failure was not theirs. Stopes herself was often astonished by the volume and intensity of the response. She had written the book because she had to, because her own ignorance had cost her a marriage and nearly broken her spirit, and she had thought it might help a few women. She had not anticipated that she was lighting a fuse that would burn through the entire culture. But the fuse did not burn without resistance. The establishment reacted with predictable fury. Many doctors condemned the book as obscene, a threat to public morality. Clergymen denounced it from the pulpit as a license for immorality. Some bookstores refused to carry it. Libraries banned it. Stopes was vilified in the press as a corrupter of youth, a woman who had abandoned all modesty. A lesser person might have retreated. But Marie Stopes was not a lesser person. She was a scientist, and she fought back with data. She pointed to the letters from grateful wives, to the testimonies of doctors who had seen the damage of ignorance and now used the book in their practice. She argued that true morality was not about silence, but about knowledge, that a Christian marriage was stronger when it was built on understanding rather than fear. And she won, not because her arguments were unassailable, though they were, but because the public had already decided. 500,000 copies in 1 year was not the work of a scandal. It was a mandate. The old guard could rage, but they could not put the fire out. What made married love truly world-changing was not merely its content, but its context. It arrived at a moment when women were on the verge of winning the vote. In 1918, the Representation of the People Act gave the vote to women over 30 who met minimum property qualifications. The symbolic connection was powerful. The same year that women gained a voice in the public square, they gained a voice in the bedroom. The two liberations were intertwined. A woman who could not understand her own body could not fully exercise her rights. A woman who was a legal non-entity in her marriage could not be a true citizen. Stopes did not simply give women a book, she gave them a tool of self-determination. The knowledge in married love was the key to a locked room. And once the door was open, women began to ask other questions. About birth control, about maternal health, about the right to say no. Stopes's own story became part of the myth. She was not a remote expert writing from a safe distance. She was a survivor. Her first marriage, to a man named Reginald Ruggles Gates, had been annulled in 1916 on grounds of non-consummation after 5 years. The annulment was a public humiliation, but it was also a revelation. She later wrote that she and her husband had been so ignorant, so utterly uninstructed in the basic facts of life, that they had never successfully consummated the marriage. She had been a virgin bride, a brilliant academic who did not understand her own anatomy. The shame of that failure drove her to research, to read the medical texts that were available to her, and to discover that millions of other women were trapped in the same ignorance. When she eventually found a loving and physically complete relationship with her second husband, the contrast was so stark that she knew she had to write the book. She said, famously, that knowledge gained at such a price should be placed at the service of humanity. And so she placed it. The personal became the political and the historical, all in one bound volume. The ripple effects extended far beyond Britain. Married Love was translated into multiple languages. It circulated in the United States, where the Comstock laws still forbade the mailing of any material deemed obscene, and where birth control advocates were regularly arrested. It was smuggled into Australia, into India, into the far corners of the English-speaking world. The book became a kind of currency among women who were beginning to organize, to demand not just political rights but bodily autonomy. In the 1920s and 30s, the movement for birth control, which Stopes herself champions through her clinics, was inseparable from the movement for sexual education. And the foundation of all of it was the simple, radical idea that a woman had the right to understand her own body and to make choices about it. The Victorian ideal of the sexless angel was not reformed. It was demolished, replaced by something far more complex and far more human. The impact on the wedding night itself was gradual but measurable. By the 1920s, the locked bathroom door was becoming a less common feature of honeymoons. Mothers who had read Married Love in their 20s passed a gentler, more honest version of the talk to their own daughters. Marriage manuals, once the secret property of grooms, began to be written for both partners, sometimes explicitly as wedding gifts. The language shifted. Words that had been excised from dictionaries crept back into polite conversation. The body was no longer entirely a source of shame. It took decades, of course. Change at the intimate level moves slower than law or fashion. Many brides in the 1920s and 30s still entered marriage with incomplete knowledge. But the trajectory had reversed. For the first time in a century, ignorance was no longer the official ideal. Knowledge, however partial, was the new aspiration. And the girls who grew up in that changed landscape were the mothers of the mid-century, who would themselves press for the sexual revolution still to come. But the story does not end with Marie Stopes, because even as Married Love transformed the landscape, a quieter but equally significant shift was occurring in the medical profession. The handful of brave doctors who had questioned the doctrine of female passionlessness had grown into a movement. By the 1920s, a new generation of physicians, some of them women, were publishing research on female sexual response that validated everything Stopes had argued. The concept of vaginismus was finally understood as a psychological condition, treatable with patience and education rather than surgery. The rest cure for neurasthenia was discredited. The clitoridectomy, which had been championed by Baker Brown, was relegated to the margins of medical history, a shameful episode that doctors would prefer to forget. The official line that respectable women had no sexual desire was quietly abandoned, though never formally repudiated. It simply faded, like a bad rumor that no one repeats once better information arrives. And yet, the legacy of that silence was tenacious. The generations of women who had suffered through traumatic wedding nights in the Victorian era did not vanish. They lived on into the 20th century, carrying their unspoken pain. Some of them were grandmothers by the time Married Love was published, and they read it not to change their own lives but to understand them. The experience of finally having words for what had happened to them was both cathartic and devastating. Some wrote to Stopes to say that the book had come too late for them, but that they were buying copies for their granddaughters. The transmission of knowledge had skipped a generation, and now it was being restored. The Victorian bride, with her white dress and her bewildered terror, became a figure of pity and outrage, a ghost who would haunt the conscience of the reforming 20th century. What, then, was the final tally? How many women were traumatized by the wedding night in the decades before the veil was lifted? No one can say for certain. The records are fragmentary. Diaries were burned. Letters were destroyed. The silence that preceded the wedding night was often followed by a silence that lasted a lifetime. But the clues are everywhere. In the novels of the period, which hint at marital misery with a discretion that is its own form of testimony. In the court records of annulment and separation cases, where the word cruelty sometimes masked something more specific. In the asylum registers where the diagnosis of hysteria or melancholia was often the final destination of a woman whose spirit had been broken on her wedding night. The scale of the suffering was vast, and its invisibility was not an accident. It was the intended product of a system that equated ignorance with virtue and silence with safety. The system was not created by any single villain. It was the collective work of a culture that feared female desire, that needed to control reproduction, that defined respectability in terms that were incompatible with human biology. But it was sustained by the active decision, repeated millions of times, to keep girls in the dark. Every mother who whispered the duty talk instead of the truth was doing what she believed was best. Every doctor who dismissed a wife's pain as hysteria was practicing what he had been taught. Every clergyman who preached submission was upholding a social order that seemed eternal. The machinery of ignorance was made of good intentions, and that is what makes it so chilling. It was not cruelty in the traditional sense. It was a systematic failure of empathy, a collective refusal to imagine what it felt like to be the girl in the white dress, sitting alone on the edge of the bed with no map for the night ahead. The surprising detail that emerges from the wreckage is this. The cure was not a new technology or a political revolution, though both played a part. The cure was language, simply giving women the words to describe their own experience. The Victorian brides were not victims of biology. They were victims of a vocabulary that had been stolen from them. When Marie Stopes wrote Married Love, her greatest achievement was not the medical accuracy of her descriptions, though she strived for that. It was the permission she gave to speak, to name the body, to name desire, to name trauma. Once named, the thing could be understood. Once understood, it could be changed. The locked bathroom door was not broken open by force. It was opened by the simple, radical act of telling the truth. And as the 20th century unfolded, the truth continued to spread. Sex education, however imperfect, entered the schools. Birth control became legal and widely available. The women's liberation movement of the 1970s demanded an end to the double standard and to the silence that still lingered. The marital rape exemption was abolished in the United Kingdom in 1991 and in all 50 American states by 1993. The legal doctrine of coverture, which had erased a wife's existence, was gradually dismantled through a series of reforms that gave married women the right to own property, to keep their wages, to enter contracts. The wedding night was no longer a legal transfer of bodily ownership. It became, at least in theory, a mutual celebration. The arc of change was long and incomplete, but it bent unmistakably toward the light. Marie Stopes lived to see much of this transformation. She died in 1958, a celebrated and controversial figure. Her later life was marked by causes that complicate her legacy. She was a vocal supporter of eugenics, and her views on race and disability are indefensible by modern standards. She was not a perfect hero, but the book she wrote in 1918, born of her own painful ignorance and her fierce determination, remains a landmark. It sits in libraries and used bookshops, its cloth cover faded, its pages yellowed. And if you open it, you can still feel the electric charge of a truth that was, for millions of women, the first they had ever heard. Every heart desires a mate. The sentence is simple. The journey that began with it was not. It stretched from the cold hotel bathrooms of the Victorian era to the sunlit rooms of a freer world. And at every step, it was powered by the voices of women who refused to be silent any longer. And those voices still echo. If you listen, you can hear them in the quiet spaces of history, in the folded letters tied with ribbon, in the diary pages hidden beneath floorboards, in the margins of books that were supposed to be kept under lock and key. They are not loud voices. They were never supposed to be loud, but they refused to disappear. The Victorian bride who locked herself in the bathroom on her wedding night did not know she was part of a movement. She thought she was alone. She thought her terror was a private failing, a weakness of character, a proof that she was not the pure angel she had been trained to be. And yet her act of hiding, of saying no with her body when her voice had been taken, was a form of testimony. It was evidence, and evidence accumulates. The bathroom doors, the hasty annulments, the nervous breakdowns, the letters to Marie Stopes, all of it built a case that could not be dismissed. The case was simple. Ignorance is not innocence. Ignorance is a wound, and a wound that is never cleaned does not heal. We live now in the world that those voices built. A world where a girl can, in most places, learn about her own body before her wedding night. A world where consent is a concept enshrined in law, however imperfectly enforced. A world where a book like Married Love seems almost quaint rather than revolutionary. But the distance we have traveled is not as great as it sometimes feels. The silence has changed its shape, but it has not vanished. It lives in the awkward pauses of a parent who does not know how to begin the conversation. It lives in the school boards that debate whether sex education is appropriate. It lives in the persistent myth that female desire is lesser, simpler, or more dangerous than male desire. The Victorian machinery of ignorance was dismantled, but its parts were scattered rather than destroyed. You can still find them. In the shame that young people carry into their first relationships, in the marriages that falter, because two people never learned to talk about what they need, in the cultural messages that still, even now, tell women that their bodies are projects to be managed rather than homes to be inhabited. The brides of the 1850s would recognize some of this. They would understand the feeling of standing on the edge of an experience with no map. They would understand the gap between what is promised and what is delivered. But they would also be astonished by what has changed. The very fact that we are here, in the quiet of a darkened room, listening to a voice tell the truth about what happened to them, would have seemed impossible. They lived in a world where even naming the body was an act of defiance. We live in a world where that defiance has become, in some places, almost ordinary. That is a form of progress. Not the kind that arrives with parades and proclamations, but the kind that arrives in the dark, in a whisper, in the turning of a page. The kind that Marie Stopes set in motion when she sat down and wrote the words that millions of women were desperate to read. But history is never a simple line from darkness to light. Every liberation carries its own complexities. The freedom to know is also the freedom to choose, and choice brings its own burdens. The Victorian bride was crushed by the weight of ignorance, but the modern bride is sometimes crushed by the weight of expectation. The silent suffering of the past has been replaced, in some cases, by a noisy cultural pressure to perform, to be the perfect lover, to have the perfect wedding night, to post the perfect photographs. The locked bathroom door has been replaced by the curated social media feed, another kind of performance, another kind of silence. The truth of what happens in the private spaces of our lives is still, for many, impossibly difficult to speak aloud. The words are available now, but the courage to use them is still hard to find. So the story of the Victorian wedding night is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the cost of silence, a cost that is still being paid in different currencies by different people, in different rooms. Every time a person enters an intimate experience without full understanding, without full consent, without the words to name what is happening, the ghost of the Victorian bride is present. She is not a warning from a distant era. She is a mirror. She asks us what we have learned and whether we have learned enough. She asks us to look at the silences we still keep, the questions we still do not ask, the shame we still carry in our bodies. She does not judge. She has been judged enough. She simply waits, in her white dress, at the edge of the bed, for the conversation that could have saved her, and she wonders if we are having it yet. If this story has stayed with you, if it has made you think about the silences in your own history, in your own family, in your own life, then it has done what history is supposed to do. History is not a collection of dates and names. It is a collection of choices, and every choice made by our ancestors has left a residue on our present. The choice to keep girls ignorant was not made once. It was made millions of times, by millions of people, across decades. And the choice to break that ignorance was made the same way, one conversation at a time. One book, one whispered truth. The world does not change in a single dramatic moment. It changes in the accumulation of small, brave acts. The act of a mother who decides to tell her daughter the truth. The act of a doctor who listens to a woman's pain and believes her. The act of a writer who puts words to what has never been spoken. The act of a bride who, even in her terror, tells someone what happened. These acts do not feel heroic in the moment. They feel awkward, frightening, uncertain. But they are the stitches that hold the fabric of progress together. The Victorian era lasted a long time, but it ended. Its silences were broken. Not completely, not perfectly, but broken nonetheless. And the breaking was the work of ordinary people who decided that the truth was worth the risk. Marie Stopes was an extraordinary person, but she could not have done it alone. She needed the women who bought her book, who passed it to their friends, who wrote her letters, who brought it into their homes and their marriages. She needed the quiet revolutionaries who never became famous, whose names are lost to history, but whose actions changed the course of millions of lives. That is the real lesson of this story, that the biggest changes often begin with the smallest acts. A locked door, a cry in the night, a letter to a stranger, a book hidden in a sewing basket, a conversation that should have happened generations earlier, each one a pebble dropped into still water. The ripples are still moving outward, touching shores we cannot see. So, as you settle deeper into your blankets, as the quiet of this hour wraps around you, think about those ripples. Think about the brides who wept in Paris and never told anyone why. Think about the mothers who wanted to protect their daughters and built cages instead. Think about the men who, for all their power, were also trapped in a system that taught them to see their wives as vessels rather than partners. Think about the children born from those wedding nights, the children who grew up in the shadow of their parents' unspoken pain. And think about the long, slow, patient work of healing, the work that is still underway. Because the story of the Victorian wedding night is not over. It is still being written in every marriage, in every relationship, in every honest conversation between two people who are trying to see each other clearly. The dress has changed. The candles have been replaced by electric lights. The hotel has been replaced by a home. But the question remains, what are we telling our daughters? What are we teaching our sons? And what will they wish 100 years from now that we had been brave enough to say? If this history has meant something to you, then let the quiet settle. Breathe. The night is long, and the past is full of voices. Some of them are crying. Some of them are singing. And some, like the voice you are hearing now, are simply telling the truth. The truth does not always bring sleep, but it brings a kind of peace. The peace of knowing that what was hidden has been brought into the light. The peace of knowing that the silence does not have to last forever. The peace of knowing that the locked door can be opened, that the white dress can be taken off, that the morning comes even after the longest night. Thank you for listening. If you would like more stories like this, stories that peek into the quiet corners of history and pull the curtains back just a little, please like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I read them, and they make the long hours of research and writing feel less like a solitary vigil and more like a shared journey. Until next time, rest well, and may your dreams be kinder than the history we have just walked through.